Let's come to the 22nd presentation of the Parayana. And we're building what in English is called an accumulation. There is a quality where the real energy accumulates so that the dynamic gains amperage through a reservoir, as it were, so that when the application comes, it is quicker than instantaneous. Because the accumulation of energy, which does not expend itself in causality, acquires a distribution of infinity. It's a principle that all starships use. We're looking at the accumulation of the way in which language is the metronome for the accumulation of civilization. And for a civilization to occur, the language which has been oral for, in the case of our star system, of our planet, of our world, the oral language goes back a couple of 100,000 years. Our species, Homo sapiens, occurred first that we know of in the far south of Africa, along the coast, some 200,000 years ago. And the first fossil figure was a female. The earlier species of hominids did not have a neurological system that was refined enough in order to be able to speak a language any more than just a sporadic, almost terminational quality of indications and maybe signals and so forth. Our species, Homo sapiens, has an evolutionary, physiological, neurological transformation. The thoracic area of our spinal column has the capacity to modify breathing, to modify breath, with such incredible rapidity that it's been measured at 60 times per second. So that the real filigree of being able to modify breath gave the possibility over the tens of thousands of years to be able to develop whatever gutturals or vocatives there were into oral language. The first time that there were indications of a writing down of language came with designations of nominatives and an nominative of number. And this was used, obviously, for transactions. The great study in 2 volumes of this is done by Denise Schmand-Basserat, and it's called Before Writing, published by the University of Texas Press in Austin. This is volume 1. And volume 1 is From Counting to Cuneiform. And she is the one who found that all of these archaeological throwaways these little bits of clay that occur in the tens of thousands around any archaeological dig, especially in what we call the Middle East, the British call the Near East. And these little counters are the origins of the way in which we were developing written language. And she takes great care in showing that the evolution of these that had little marks on them became eventually promoting trade in such a way that it grew, and instead of there being the occasional transaction, there began to be business as usual. Entrepreneurs, marketers, commerce. And in order to facilitate the multiplicity and the rapidity of deals, the clay was formed into palm-sized pouches, which then would be open so that one could put all of these little items within them, and that this would be the contract. And you would hand over the contract to whoever is buying from whoever is selling, and in this way, the handshake is a primordial indication of a deal has been done. And in pre-Socratic Greece, the sophists always taught in the way that they ended their explication with a clenching of the deal. Did you get it? Did you understand? Did you grasp it? And that word that comes down to us as grasp, in Sanskrit is graha. So that English from Latin, from Greek, very cognate with Sanskrit to Marathi, Hindi, so forth, that gur, that gra, the Buddha spoke, historical Buddha spoke at Rajagraha, a elevated site where he would deliver the most poignant of his remembered presentations, who when they were written down became sutras. Sanskrit sutra means a thread. It means being able to read, or from the written form to recite, so that someone could hear it or someone could read it in such a way that they could recite in the mind's voice. And so reading became an interior hearing. And just as hearing, having ears to hear, having this pair of ears to hear, the pair of eyes to see, gave this kind of kinesthetic quality that hearing and seeing language are related. In Latin schools in the late Republic, in the Roman Empire, when you would do your lessons, you could not read silently. There would be a class proctor that would, like a Zen, Zazen master with a keisak, rap you one. You had to read it out loud off the page. No silent reading in the Roman Empire schools and education. Whereas the great wisdom tradition was that you learned through several transformations to not only read silently, but to read in a flow that was so swift and dynamic, you did not have time to particularize any particular word or any particular phrase or sentence. because you were used to folding in, like a deck of cards that's cut, and then you fold them in. But you fold the cards in along with the spaces between the cards in the real wisdom way. And so the hiatuses of the wise speech, which were mixed and distributed artfully in the way in which a discourse is delivered, to emphasize your hearing the meaning beyond just the content of what you hear, that in between the words there is a strategic pausing. And in reading, the pausing is the space, the minute space between the letters, the larger space between the words, eventually making groups of words in lines, arranged especially in pairs, so that you would have a couplet. And then, because that pairing is so primordial, you would have a pair of pairs, and then you would have four. You would have what in English lit is called a quatrain, what in world lit is called a stanza, and that this was a unit of written poetic in which a higher wisdom language could be delivered. But it becomes powerful when the accumulation of writing with this kind of not only spacing between letters and then words and then lines and then stanzas, quatrains, and eventually to large-scale compositions that are traditionally called hymns. And some of the hymns are not like just short hymns that we would associate, but long hymns. And in one of the earliest huge collections of 10 massively long, complex, and accumulated hymns is the Rig Veda, that was first written down and made in that writing down the grasping of the language of Sanskrit as a written language that could be read or could be intoned. And when it was intoned, it was Vedic. When it was read, it was not Vedic but poetic. And that poetic did not come from the language that was being modulated as Sanskrit, one of the earliest so-called Indo-European languages, but the spacing, the presencing of the articulation of the opennesses of the spaces into the registry of words, vowels, phonemes, phrases, sentences, lines, quatrains, etc. All of this accumulation had a wisdom goddess who in Sanskrit her name was Vak, V-A-C, and one can find that there are whole academic studies and collections on Vak. The concept of the word in selected Hindu tantras. A tantra is a sutra that brings two together as not just a one, but as a tuned pair that is able, in that tuning, to bring into play the space between the two so that a pair is esoterically a third, giving breath, giving the air to the way in which they talk together. And so language from the goddess gifts our kind of life with the ability to talk with each other in such a refined way that we spontaneously have all the meaning that there is in what normally would be called a communion, a commune, a sharing of the presencing of the breath that nourishes language to be real. This is called wisdom teaching. In the Rig Veda, it's very difficult for people in the English language to read it because the translation of the whole Rig Veda together, done by a man named Griffiths about 100 some years ago, was Victorian English stilted and misunderstood because it was early on many of the subtleties that have come out. And one of the great translators of Sanskrit in our time is a woman, of course, Wendy Doniger, who is at the University of Chicago. And the Penguin Classics has published since almost 35 years her translation of the Rig Veda. The cover, by the way, of the Rig Veda is a written manuscript of the Rig Veda in the ancient mode. It's written on birch bark with a soot-based ink that 3,500 years ago was invented to convey something like this. This is out of the 10 books of the Rig Veda, of dozens and dozens, and altogether the Rig Veda has 1,028 hymns. So that there are 100 plus hymns, usually, or stanzas. This one is Rig Veda 10.71. It's the 71st of the 10th hymn. This hymn speaks of the origins of the sacred word, speech, or language, feminine, a goddess, and of its ritual recreation through the verbal contests of the Vedic sacrifice. The social nature of speech is emphasized, the birth of speech in friendship, and its use by all of the assembly and by the 4 priests with their individual functions. The enemy of true speech is represented as the rival of the author of this hymn. The foe of true speech is the liar, the deceiver, who will misuse, who will manipulate into falsity, who will create an artificial intelligence that parades itself as the meaning. And this quality is almost impossible to overcome unless there is a commune, a community, which has the ability to regain the hearing and let it mature into the seeing of vision. Because in vision, one has an infinite field of differential consciousness. And it is the language access that is the royal road to enter into that field of vision. And that field of vision falls in love with another field, the field of nature, And Mother Nature is very much attracted in love. And it is Father consciousness gaining love of her wisdom that allows for reality then to have a very special, tuned, shared presence quality that accumulates. The very last of the 11 stanzas to Rig Veda hymn 10.71 read in her translation. I've modified it just slightly, taking out some of the articles like the thes. I've taken the thes out. One sits bringing to blossom the flower of the verses. Bringing to blossom what will become the flower of the verses. So one sits motionless, quiet. It's more ancient than 3,500 years ago. In the northern parts of what is today the United States and the southern parts of what today is Canada, the line that splits those two countries is geographically, politically, just a map line. The primordial peoples that have lived in that area for more than 12,000 years have a great celebration that was the complement to a midwinter celebration. It's the midsummer celebration, the solstices. And whereas the winter solstices were always the most primordial, going back tens of thousands of years in origin and celebration, the summer solstice was a refinement of that winter solstice coming to fruition as the midsummer, when Shakespeare wanted, as a young man, an ultimate loving play. He wrote A Midsummer Night's Dream. It is this quality in the American Indians of that U.S.-Canada border area, centering on the Siksika in their language, which was Algonquin, which was spoke from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast once by hundreds of tribes, by dozens of nations. And the English term for Siksika, which means the people who walk so long that their moccasins turn black. They have walked the earth not so long in terms of this time in calendars, but of thousands of years of walking the earth. They're called the black feet and the black foot, depending on which country you're in. And the central ceremony is the Okan. And in the Okan, it is a midsummer ceremony that has its trigger that becomes the root of that ritual ceremony. And the language of it is all controlled by a woman who has, in the depths of winter, has the vision around the winter solstice that she will sponsor a summer solstice, a sun dance in Algonquin and Okan, and she, as the holy woman, will fast and go into a deep yoga for 6 months, so that when the time comes, she is like the one sits bringing to blossom the flower of the verses. And the holy woman in the Okan sits alone in her teepee in the circles of teepees. And she is outside of the circle of the teepees in her special teepee, which means that there's an opening in the circle of the tribe's teepees, arranged, and all of the ceremonies take place in the center. And in the very center is the Sundance Lodge that is made by men who have fought in wars, veterans. And those warriors make the Sundance Lodge in such a way that it has evergreens woven into a kind of a lattice work, and at the very center is a tree with a fork at the top that has been cut by the bravest of the warriors who have gone out in a wagon, and they have cut that tree and trimmed that tree and brought back that great forked center pole. And anyone in the community who has a prayer writes that prayer in Algonquin, and it is on like bark, like birch bark, and is then attached to long poles that are leaned together in the fork, the presence of that Sundance tree, and all of the prayers of that year nestle there in the space of that tuning. And because that tuning fork is not only the holy woman, but she will have a son for that particular Okan who has prepared himself in those 6 months to be the sacrifice, not the warrior who injures or who can kill, but the sacrificial who can endure with patience what would be unendurable for a man, the physiological injury. And he will be attached to the top of that pole tree, like a prayer guaranteeing the breath underneath all of the prayers of the people. And the two cords that will come down, the rawhide cords will come down, and the tips of buffalo antlers will be put into his shoulders, tied by those rawhide cords to the top of the prayer Sundance pole, and he will have an eagle bone whistle, and the only sound he can make is the sound of a triumphant eagle in his pain. If he cries out, the entire Sundance is over. It has failed. He can only use his breath to cry out through the eagle's sound bone whistle. And if he does this long enough, patiently enough, in the suffering, to pull those antler tags free, with bits of flesh, they leave scars. Then the holy woman will cut the dried buffalo tongues, the tongues by which, in Algonquin, Tatanka utters the nutrition that makes life on those northern plains possible. The robes for clothing, the antlers, the meat, the sinews, the whole organization of the culture to be able to be a unified tribe that hunts together to make their meat every spring. And it is this quality that in the Rig Veda, the Hotr, H-O-T-R, priest is the first of four. One sits bringing to blossom the flower of the verses another sings a song in Sakvari meter, who intones the poetic, is tuned to the Hoter priest, and the Hoter priest then has the silent, motionless, blossoming formed, which then flowers in the verse of the singer, who is the author of the hymn. The third, the Brahmin proclaims knowledge of ancient ways, speaks out to those gathered that this has been handed down to us since the origin of the language, since the origin of the poet-seers of the Rig Veda, who got it from others who were poet-seers before them in more ancient times. While the Advaryu ritually presses soma and measures that area. The soma is a grain-derived inebriating juice. It is a quality like scotch. It is a sacrificial quality of showing that there is a physical inebriate, but there is a poetic expansion of that into a sacred song. And that sacred song ushers in the whole accumulated heritage and inheritance of the wisdom tradition that allows for the life of that culture to reach its apex in a civilization. That civilization in ancient India was made of a pair of tunable confluences. One was the Dravidic, dark-skinned, black Indians of the Indus civilization that had been in India for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. And the light-skinned Aryan, who were not an invasion so much, but who were coming into play because they had come from Central Asia to find a written pivot and focus in a place that today is called Kabul in Afghanistan. And it was there that the first great poet of that whole Central Asian, going all the way west into far Celtic lands, going all the way east into Chinese lands, had a huge trade route forced open because of their lands being invaded by people called the Hittites, who not only invaded them, they invaded Egypt and took over Egypt and what became Greece and many other places, and they were pushed from Kabul through the Khyber Pass into northwest India, into what is today Pakistan. And it's there that the meeting of the ancient Dravidian Indus civilization met not invaders, but those refugees coming who brought a very high poetic with them. And their high poetic came together with a written language that was there in the Indus civilization, which was glyphic, much like the hieroglyphs of Egypt, much like the kind of glyphic qualities of ancient Chinese. And just recently, there are books to finally make translations possible, because usually the Harappan glyphs were on such small bits that they were like the origins of written language in the Near East, because they came from the same quality. That the origins of Mesopotamian, Near East, Middle East, Mesopotamian written language was originally cuneiform and only became alphabetized when there was a transform of the cuneiform culture by a North Semitic genius that changed Sumer into Akkad. And there was a feminine writer, Enneduanna, who was able to make a very high poetic in cuneiform. And when the farthest western reach of their trade routes, which went from the Indus Valley to the island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean, via the coast jutting Fennel Peninsula, Ras Shamra, that there the inheritors of that great Sargon the Great trading route at the end of the crust of the Fertile Crescent of great discursive, high poetic language, the Phoenicians, because they were doing trading routes that didn't just go east into the Indus River, India, but went far west across the entire Mediterranean. And by going far west across all of the Mediterranean and going through the Straits of Gibraltar out into the Atlantic Ocean coastal areas, came across the ancient descendants of the Celtics, originally coming from Central Asia. And so alphabets were made in Phoenicia about the same time that one began to have alphabets made from the vestiges of ancient Avestan into Sanskrit 3,500 years ago. Let's take a break and come back.